All right, folks, this is our last lesson, our last lesson with new material in it, at least for this semester. So we're talking about slope on day 3 of slope. So today we're going to talk about parallel and perpendicular lines. We mentioned the other day, and we noted that we graphed two lines, and they happen to have the same slope, and we kind of noted that, hey, these lines are the same distance at every point, so they would never cross, right? And that's generally true. If two lines have the same slope, then they're parallel, right? Which means they'll never cross, they'll never intersect, right? Okay, now an exception to this is we talked about vertical lines the other day. And so vertical lines have undefined slope, right? And you wouldn't necessarily say undefined equals undefined because, by the definition, there's no value, but they are parallel, okay? So two lines with undefined slope, or in other words, two vertical lines, they still are parallel, right? Vertical lines are parallel. All right. So let's talk about perpendicular then. So two lines with slopes 1 and 2. So you have two slopes there, m1 and m2. So remember, m is the letter we use for slope, and so 1 and 2 are just distinguishing one from the other. So they're perpendicular if m1 is equal to negative 1 over m2. Okay, so what that means is they're opposite, right? Because the signs are different, right? Here we have a positive, here we have a negative, but they're also reciprocals, okay? In other words, if you took m1 and flipped it upside down and brought it to the bottom, that's where m2 is going to be, right? So in other words, like 3/4 could be m1, and m2 would be negative 4/3. Okay, so they're opposites, but they're also reciprocals. So you flip them and you change the sign. Okay, so that's what opposite reciprocals mean. Opposites change sign, and reciprocals mean you flip it, right? Okay, all right. So and then this next statement basically says if you multiply m1 by negative 1 over m1, you would get negative 1, right? So in other words, if you multiply the slope, the two perpendicular slopes, you'll get negative 1, okay? And that's true if you think about it. If you multiply 3/4 times negative 4/3, reciprocals cancel out to 1, but since they're opposites, you'll get a negative, right? So positive times negative is a negative, and then 3/4 times 4/3 would be 12/12, right? Or in other words, 1, okay? So whenever you multiply opposite reciprocals, or whenever you multiply perpendicular slopes, you'll get negative 1. So that's a way to check if they're perpendicular. All right, if it's not apparent that they're flipped and sign changes. All right, so now going back to what we talked about with vertical lines on the last slide, we cannot compare slopes of horizontal and vertical lines because we have undefined slope, right, for vertical lines. But we know, right, inherently that a vertical line is perpendicular to a horizontal line, right? And the reason we can't compare them is because if a horizontal line has slope 0, the reciprocal of that would be 1 over 0, right? So that would be undefined, and that's what a vertical line is. So, but we can't multiply undefined by 0, right? That wouldn't give us negative 1. So anyway, so vertical lines and horizontal lines are special cases, and we know that their horizontal line is always perpendicular with the vertical line. All right. Now, one thing just to mention and kind of get into some geometry a little bit. Perpendicular, what that means is lines cross at a right angle. Okay. At a right angle. Okay. So meaning that, or another way to think of it is when you have an intersection of two perpendicular lines, what happens is that you get four equal angles, and so basically all of these are the same, right? And since we know 360 degrees is one full rotation. If we divide that full rotation here into 4 equal pieces, 360 divided by 4 would be 90, right? So each of these angles would be 90 degrees. Okay, so anyway, so that's a little bit of geometry behind parallel and perpendicular lines.